Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I am Tamara Johnson Shealey. It's Friday morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's going to be a great conversation this morning with Mr. David Slavin. I am sneaking away and just wanted to come in and get this party started. Let's see where he is, Mr. David Slavin, my trusty co-host. Hi, David. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Tamara.
How are you?
I'm hanging in there like a loose tooth.
Well, you keep hanging in there. I know that you have a great broadcast planned this morning. It's going to be a quite interesting conversation. You have a guest with you this morning. Let's bring her into the broadcast. Let's see where this beautiful lady is. The woman in, is that red she's wearing? Good morning, woman in red.
Hello, good morning, Tamara and David.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. David, Nina, It is your show.
Okay.
A conversation, white America. So this Black woman is going to head out.
Let's see what we say.
Thank you. Hi, Nina.
Hi, David.
Morning to you. And we're going to just have a conversation for people who are, I think the title is a bit pretentious. I don't think we're talking to white America, yet. Maybe we will. But we're going to interrogate a lot of things and that we have been discussing over, the years, and see if we can come up with some ideas that might be helpful for for other folks thinking on the question of race, and particularly for European Americans. I tend to use that word as distinct from white, and we will talk about that more. But who are really confused and troubled by what the situation that's emerged, which is in some ways kind of I don't know, an irony or something like that, because the only reason that they have become so troubled is because things that people of color knew for years and were experiencing for years are now, much more in the face of European Americans and their identity, and lots of things about themselves they are beginning to question. It's only been 300 years, so
Don't want to jump into anything too fast.
Yeah, we don't want to do anything rash. But I thought we could start out, Nina, with an idea that I don't think is fully accurate, but it's something that I want to just kind of throw out for people to ponder about, and that is that there's been a lot of concern and talk about working class whites in the Democratic primary, presidential candidates, and that we, quote, lost them, and how do we get them back? So I thought that it might be an interesting idea to start out with the notion that poor whites are poor. Poor whites are poor, not in spite of white privilege, but because of it. And just to get people thinking, about what that might mean. What I want to talk about is the counter, the set of assumptions that have started out with the identifying privilege with benefit. And the notion that privilege is a benefit is so pervasive, both among European Americans and people of color as well. And it seems on the surface to be so obvious, so self-evident, that it's really, really hard to dislodge that notion. what I think it does is it creates a lot of rigidity in thinking, and it's also self-defeating, because if you're going to say that privilege is a benefit, then you really don't have any room to convince people that it's in their interests to repudiate it. And I think that's a big consideration. Now, you can still appeal to people on the basis of their moral, their morality, but we've seen people go up against their morality, morals, quite a bit, and particularly, it seems like there is a big discussion now among, and once again I go back to the Democratic presidential candidates, about the moral fiber of this country being undermined by Trump and by the things that his administration have done, kids in cages, and all of these things that are really both heart-wrenching and really stimulate a sense of moral outrage, right? So morality, I'm not dismissing the level of morality, but if it is the case that working class whites, by defending their privileges, are actually hurting themselves, then you got a case, you got a pretty strong case, of both a moral case and a question of self-interest, right? So so how would we proceed to understand that idea? Privilege is not a benefit. Well, if it isn't a benefit, what is it? And there, the question of class becomes really crucial to understand what's going on. And one of those questions of class has to do with how the ruling elites in this country, that 1%, that not only seem to be pretty clearly running the show and have a lot of power, that money translates into power. Concentration of wealth translates into power. So if the word privilege is something we need to think about a little bit more closely, one of the ways to describe it is, rather than as a benefit, as a ruling class invention that is part of the apparatus of maintaining social control over the rest of us.
Right.
And if that's the case, what it's really doing is creating or perpetuating the system of exploitation of labor by capital. That's how capital concentrates wealth and makes itself richer, is by exploiting. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. That's just a descriptor. That if we were going to look at Karl Marx, that's what he would say is that labor power, that workers don't have anything but their labor power to sell on the market, and the only way that capitalists will use it is if the worker works beyond simply the costs of reproducing himself, of subsistence. So that extra time that the worker works, the capitalist expropriates, and that's exploitation. And so we need to understand race and racial inequality in the context of a capitalist system and a system of exploitation. And that, it seems to me, is one of the ways that we can get a handle on what race is doing. because race is not just or what racism is doing. Because racism is not simply separation; it's separation and inequality.
Mm-hmm.
We are not just, separated; we're separate and unequal.
Right.
And what that inequality does is it creates a structure, an institutionalization, and a systematization of this inability to come together to fight for your interests
Mm-hmm.
as workers, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, it also provides the platform, the groundwork for how to bring people back together.
That's hopeful. You should say more about that.
Okay, so so the issue, therefore, is that we can't bring people back together simply on the basis of integration.
Okay.
Right? Because we're not only separate, and that would solve the integration would solve the separation question, but we're also living in deeply in unequal circumstances, right?
Right.
And so now you can't erase those unequal circumstances. The entire institutional structure and history of this country has been built upon maintaining that institutional inequality of separate and unequal. That's what Jim Crow was all about. In fact, that was what slavery was all about, because one of the ways that people evolved, or that the ruling class invented the white race, was by immunizing white working people from enslavement. That was kind of the first privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at it as in the way that I'm saying that it's not a benefit, right?
Right.
You can't you can say, well, not being enslaved is a benefit.
Right.
Just like if there was a dictatorship that decided it was going to get rid of all people who were left-handed, and they chopped off the left-handed people's left. That would be a right-handed person would have a privilege, right?
Right.
But I mean, when we're the privilege of not being enslaved but exploited, is what we're talking about. And it seems to me that this really brings up an issue, which is or an important aspect of what we're trying to kind of challenge about this whole way of thinking, is that
No, I just said I'm just listening.
Yeah. Okay. So in other words, one of the things that I would point out is that I challenge the notion that people can be white, right?
Right.
I tend to describe this position, this social position, as being one of thinking and acting white.
And as you know, I am familiar with you saying that, and I actually think it's a really good way of expressing it.
Yeah.
So please continue.
Yeah. Thank you, Nina. Yeah, no, great to have somebody to talk to here. That's
Yes.
not just
you
me.
and I have talked a lot.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, it's not just me talking into a camera.
Right.
So
I understand.
I really appreciate it.
Sure.
So what is thinking and acting white? Well, I think one of the basic premises of thinking and acting white, and this might be uncomfortable to a lot of liberals, is to have that mindset that not having your left hand cut off is a privilege, or
Gotcha.
being immune from slavery is a privilege,
Right.
is a benefit. I'm sorry, I'm
Right.
using what I meant to say is not having your left hand is a benefit,
Right.
and the only way that it is a benefit is if you think and act white. In other words, if you compare yourself to black people instead of looking up at who's manipulating the show, who's the power power that is determining, because no matter how much you are, quote, free or have your left hand, you're still being exploited.
So what I hear in that is that there's a kind of twist that takes place. And that people, I'm sorry, I'm getting kind of feedback here. But there's a sort of twist that is required for white people, so that they have to be able to think of a hand being cut off, to use the metaphor that you were expressing, as somehow being okay, and that's not really okay. And it requires that people have unwittingly had their thinking shifted to think of, well, I didn't get my hand cut off, so I'm okay. That's great.
Yeah, and to extend this to liberals, every time that a lot of this thinking came out of a short and very influential essay from 1988. Now I'm blanking out on the.
Is that the one about white fragility?
No, that's much later. But,
sorry,
but I'll come back to it. I didn't. But the idea of the invisible knapsack of white privilege, and I apologize to the woman from Barnard not Barnard, from Radcliffe and Harvard. Her name will come to me, I'm sure. But this notion of an invisible knapsack of privilege listed a whole bunch of ways in which white experience was normalized, going from the trivial, the color of Band-Aids, skin color of Band-Aids,
right,
matching your own skin,
right.
To much broader and more consequential issues about going into a job interview and feeling pretty certain that you're not going to be discriminated against because the person who's interviewing you is white, et cetera, et cetera. And lots of other issues of kind of psychological reinforcement that she brings up.
Mm-hmm.
So Peggy McIntosh.
That's it.
I got her name. So now I would say that this is really not just a problem because it focuses so much on the individual, but it's also a problem because and that's crucial about the structural context or the institutional context, mm-hmm. But also that there really is there's no thinking about the downside of being white, which again I say is not a really good way to formulate it, because so let's take a few examples that I think would be really useful to, and these are kind of big examples. One of them is really a response to Trump and his minions talking about how this is the lowest unemployment rate for Black and Hispanic people in this country, mm-hmm. ever, and that is a really interesting, because I don't know anybody who's really developed a good response to that point. They may dismiss it either as a lie or an exaggeration, but it's very likely that given the overall unemployment rate, that the unemployment rate for Black and Latinx folks is way down, as is the case for European Americans. But, and here's the big but, maybe I should use that unfortunate juxtaposition. Here's the warning sign. Black and Latino unemployment rate is still double that of whites. Yeah, European Americans, right. And so it is true that it is the lowest, maybe historically, maybe in history, at least in modern history, since World War I or whatever. But it is still double the rate for European Americans.
Right.
And if we're looking at it historically, that twice the rate of unemployment for people of color versus European Americans has been in place since the mid to late 1930s. Okay. 3 generations of time that we have had this rate, and it's really interesting to see how consistent it is, because in that long period of 3 generations, we've had periods of prosperity and periods of recession. And in all of those cases, if it's a period of prosperity, and the unemployment rate for whites goes down to 4%, let's say, which is now it's even lower than that, but if it goes down that far, the black unemployment rate is 8%.
Right.
And if in a recession, the unemployment rate for whites goes up to 8%, the unemployment rate for blacks is about 16%. And we've seen that kind of...
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Could you also say something about those statistics and how it relates to the percentage of population, that black people are out of white people? I mean, it seems like there's a proportional difference there too.
Well, if you're saying the overall black population is maybe 15% of the total,
right.
And we'll just talk about African Americans right now, so we can just. I don't want to make it into a binary. I'm not trying to eliminate Latinx folks from the overall, but if we just talk about black and white unemployment for now, we can make the conversation go a little bit more smoothly.
Okay.
I think this does apply, but if black folks are 15% of the population, used to be more, but with Hispanics, are 15 now, maybe close to 20% of the overall population. That's what we're talking about. But in whatever case, what we're saying, what we notice is that black unemployment, or people of color unemployment, tends to remain at twice the rate of European Americans.
And that's been true since 1930, is what you're saying.
1935, 36, 37, around there.
So unfortunately, that's a real stable sort of unemployment rate.
Yeah. Okay. And we have to, one of the thought problems that we have to come up with is, if this is a capitalist system, and you have 2 groups of people, one group has twice the unemployment rate of another group, the likelihood is that group would be willing to work for lower wages.
Yeah.
All right. But we have at least a logical contradiction here, about how can it be that the capitalists, who are obsessive profit maximizers, are willing to allow this workforce, or this section of the workforce, to maintain, this high, double the rate of unemployment, as the majority, the European American majority. And that may seem like you can dismiss it by saying, well, black people don't have the skills, they're not in the right place, this, that, and the other thing, all of the reasons that their education levels, et cetera. What's interesting is that when you look at the unemployment rates for black people with bachelor's degrees, let's say, or even higher degrees, they still are twice the rates
Okay.
of whites. And so we need to look a little bit more closely to get some explanation of why this is why this has been the case for 3 generations. I mean, you would think that over the course of the decades, that the temptation for capitalists to hire these folks, even if they were underskilled, would be, what the heck? I could get them for less. I'll train them, no problem. And so the unemployment rate should even out if there's a straightforward profit maximization. We can't really talk about 75, 80, almost 90 years of this without thinking that there's something going on besides the invisible hand of the market.
Right.
And that's where the question of social control comes in.
Okay.
And the question of privilege, because this is precisely what we're talking about. European Americans have it's not just twice the rate of unemployment of whites, it's that whites have half the unemployment rate of blacks. So
and that distinction seems like a good one to make.
Oh, geez. Sorry. I forgot to turn off my phone. So that question of the unemployment rate, I mean, it raises a question about something is intervening into the market, and what I would suggest that it's not a conspiracy, but it is an institutional pattern, which stems from way back from the early Virginia colony, particularly after this rebellion in 1676 in Virginia.
Is that Bacon's Rebellion?
But
is that Bacon's Rebellion?
Rebellion, yes.
Yay, I remembered.
Into the weeds, with that, but just that is when the system of racial chattel slavery was introduced.
Okay.
With the other aspect of it being the immunization of people who were of European descent from enslavement. And before that, in the early Virginia colony, there were whites who were actually chattel bondservants, and there were Africans who had gained certain, who were brought over and brought over to the Virginia colony, but who somehow managed to acquire the status of indentured servant, which and they won their freedom, and actually, so in other words, the status of Europeans and Africans in that period, the 50 years or so after the first Africans were brought to the Virginia colony, to Jamestown, was indeterminate. It was ambiguous. It was unclear. And what happened was that there were no white people then. Nobody used that term.
Right.
If you want to read about this more, Theodore William Allen wrote a 2-volume masterwork called The Invention of the White Race. And you can put yourself in touch with a website by Jeffrey B. Perry, Jeffrey B. Perry .net to get more information about Theodore William Allen's book and some summaries of it and reviews of it. We can talk about that some other time. But the point is that by the early 18th century, the tobacco colonies and in Virginia and other parts of the what became the southern states of this country had generally established this color line between free and slave. And all of those black people, well, the small minority of African Americans who were free people of color, as they were called, had all sorts of restraints and restrictions put on their rights.
Right.
So, they were in a subordinated status to any white person, including the poorest, most depraved of that community. So, in that sense, we're not talking simply about slavery. We're talking about white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that becomes the critical, because there are lots of slave societies, economic slave societies in the Caribbean basin, and it's the extended Caribbean basin, including not just Jamaica and Haiti and Santo Domingo and a number of the other islands which were producing sugar with African slave labor. Also the northeast coast of Brazil, those places. But in all of those places, one of the things that happened was that, don't want to go into too much of this. I'm trying to pull back from doing too much of this. But the social control strata in those societies was a middle class property owners, many of whom were mixed race. In the United States, we don't have that. What we have is two anomalous or unusual set of circumstances, which is that this so-called one-drop rule, which is that anybody who had one drop of African blood was considered a Negro, a black person, and the Europeans were considered white. The terminology in the 18th century becomes prevalent. One of and this does not mean that the European Americans, were escaped from exploitation. They still had no property.
Right.
And still worked as indentured servants, and of that they were given a certain set of privileges that included serving on slave patrols to maintain control over the African chattel bondservants. Now they did this for in the service of the ruling elite, in the service of the owners of the plantations and the slaves. Mm-hmm. And they got a certain amount of pay for it, but it was not commensurate with the amount of risk and labor that was involved in this, doing these things takes people away from being, from farming their crops. Right. So that's the side of the story that we really need to keep in mind. The other thing that it did was that this differentiation, this separation and inequality, meant that the working poor in particularly in the southern plantation economies, could not get together as they had. And this is another point why it is so important to understand that first 50 years from 1619 down to the 1660s, 70s is so important, is because they did get together. European and African bond servants, chattel servants did get together and resist the plantation owners. And in the case of 1676, by a a violent revolution, an armed revolution. So this became, insurrection insurance for the ruling elite. And the thing about it is that what is so peculiar in the United States, the peculiarity of the peculiar institution, as slavery was called, euphemistically, is not simply that there were that we had hereditary chattel bond servitude, but that there was a group of people who were working people, propertyless people, who were immune to that and were actually, through their privileges, made to act both as a social control force against their class, counterparts, and at the same time think of themselves as superior.
So they are enjoying a privilege, but they aren't getting benefit because they can't be property owners or have any of those kinds of.
Yeah, that's and that is an argument that some historians, not just some, but have really contested. There's an argument by the standard argument in colonial history is that in the South, slavery created a white middle class, and that the numbers of working class, of propertyless workers in the South was minuscule. It just didn't even matter. And that what we had was a pattern in the South of big plantation owners like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington and Monroe and Madison from Virginia, and small yeoman farmers, as they're called, small farmers.
Right.
One of the things that Ted Allen challenges in that, I mean, and he did 25 years of research into the colonial records to come up with this, is that there were substantial numbers of, quote, poor whites, and that as W.E.B. Du Bois says in Black Reconstruction, in his first chapters, that slave labor drove down the standard of living of the poor whites, because they were thrown into competition with people who were being, basically, they were paid no wages at all and were just being, kept at the subsistence level. So it because we're talking about one working class, right? That there it really is one working class. What you get is a drive to the bottom, and that's particularly true because of the competition between free and slave labor, and the fact that plantation owners had a vested interest in increasing the skill levels of the people that they owned, right? That were their property. It meant that they trained African Americans to be blacksmiths and seamstresses and et cetera. All of the things, I'm using blacksmiths and seamstresses because the typical gender,
Right.
But so both typically male and female jobs, skilled jobs, were there. There was plenty of slave masters who were willing and saw the profit in imparting those skills. And of course, not reading. By the early 19th century, reading was considered to be dangerous. There were several slave revolts in which that ban was put in place. But what it meant was that for whites, now we could call them that, whites who were seamstresses and blacksmiths and carpenters and all of these other trades that they had competition from people who were not
working for free.
Yeah, they were virtually free labor,
Right.
above and beyond what it took to to keep them healthy and working.
Right.
In other words, subsistence. So with that kind of a system in place, the 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 thinking and acting white part of it, the cultural aspect of this, is simply that that to convince poor whites of their superiority, of looking at their themselves only from in comparison with African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to see African Americans as a threat, but to see them as a threat as African Americans as opposed to as slaves. So you would think that poor whites would be anti-slavery, and yet and in fact there were several, from what I've read of early the early history of the United States, of the 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 independent, the colonies after independence. What you find is that there were several slave revolts that took place, in which the black leaders of the slave revolts appealed to poor whites to join them. So they, obviously there was some thinking that was going on there, that that this potential could be realized. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but we have a pretty substantial evidence that the Civil War was fought not just between the North and the South, mm-hmm. And not just between the slaves and their masters, but also there was a civil war within the whites, within the white population. Okay. And there were hundreds of thousands of poor whites who either refused to fight or actually took up arms against the South, against the Confederacy. Okay. So there was an understanding that rich man's war, poor man's fight, and that
Can I ask a question? Yeah. In terms of the Civil War and the white population that fought against the Confederacy, what I was wondering is, as the war continued, did Confederate white soldiers also begin to abandon what they were doing? Was there any shift like that took place?
Yeah, a lot of what we're talking about is, as the war dragged on, it became more and more desertions and all that. But that was really secondary. I mean, the most important thing that was going on is this, what Du Bois called the general strike of black labor in the Confederacy, and that general strike was probably more important than the several hundred thousand black African American men who joined the Union Army. Mm-hmm. It was at least as important militarily, because black people just simply walked away from the plantations or refused to do the work, and so and they went over to the Union lines and they did the work that the Confederacy wanted them to do for the war effort for the Union. Mm-hmm. So millions of people were involved in that. Hundreds of thousands of poor whites. Okay, so what the point is that this system has a vulnerability to it, and the vulnerability is both black resistance, mm-hmm. and the growing awareness by European Americans that no matter what the ruling elites tell them about being white, and that they're privileged, that their privileges are a benefit, and that that the best thing to do is to maintain loyalty to the white race. You know, there are times in history in which the Black Reconstruction being one of them, the aftermath of the Civil War, in which Black and white working people did join together, did understand that the whites had a common interest with African Americans, with the freed people, you know, in the late 1860s and into the 1870s, and did make common cause. But what happens in all of these cases when there is a coming together, when there is a solidarity, is that the ruling elites have found a way to reimpose this racial privilege system, and whites have fallen for it. They've taken the bait, so to speak. And what seems to be the case now, and I think that this is, you know, kind of an important issue to raise, is that there are growing movements of solidarity, of coming together. And the problem is that most people are not aware, or most whites that are not aware that this has happened before. You know, that in almost in every crisis in American history, the crisis has been precipitated by the fact that white workers started to come together with African Americans and, you know, Hispanics, but mainly in the East, it's been that solidarity, but that the solidarity has been disrupted by a combination of repression and what, you know, some people call bribery. You know, it's much more systematic than that. It does not, and one of those periods that I think is real important for for our understanding of the present day is what happened during the New Deal. You know, the 1930s were really important period in which a lot of concessions to, you know, working people came about because there was really a mass movement to build unions and to fight against the power of capital, to exploit workers. And those restrictions on exploitation that were in place that were crucially important to setting up the welfare state and you know, things that we have, Social Security and certain the ability, the legal right to organize unions and collectively bargain for working people. And there was a period of much more relative economic equality between the classes in the period of the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, in which 1/3 or more of the working people in this country were organized into unions.
Okay.
So it's not an accident that the highest, the highest rate of unionization occurred at the same time as the lowest levels of economic or distribution of wealth were at their most egalitarian. Never was egalitarian, but
well, I was going to say, wasn't it also during that time that some of these things got put into place by the government that also kind of increased the distance? You know, like when you've talked to me about the GI Bill and the unequal way it was applied, and you know, the access to education and access to home loans and things like that.
What is that is the kind of the kicker in this whole process that took place, is that as the distribution of wealth between the rich, the capitalist class, and the working class narrowed, the gap between black and white increased.
Okay.
All right. And that's the issue. So when Social Security was introduced, 80% of black people lived in the South, and 80% of them worked in domestic labor or in agricultural labor. They were sharecroppers mostly, and they worked in women worked in white people's houses, as domestic servants. So the Social Security Act explicitly barred the workers in those two categories from participating in Social Security, and did not require their employers to pay into Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. So there's two things about that. One of which is that 80% of black workers, therefore black working people, were not covered by Social Security for about almost a generation. Maybe in the early 50s it began to shift in two ways. One of which was that black people tended to were moving out of those two sectors of domestic service and agriculture and into other manufacturing and other categories. And the other thing is that there were certain shifts and changes in the rules and regulations of who was eligible, right? But on a second point about that is that in the 1930s, there were still millions of European Americans who were agricultural laborers who were also excluded. So you can see, and of course, the impetus for excluding domestic and agricultural labor came from the Dixiecrats, from the Democrats of the South, who were committed to and maintaining inequality between black and white working people in the South. So, in other words, sustaining the privileges of the white worker. And so, instead of the Social Security being a right of any citizen, right, in the country, which is the way that it was introduced throughout the industrialized world, in Europe and Japan, places like that. You were a citizen. You were eligible for a retirement income,
right?
So instead of that, it became a white privilege,
right? So you've got a generation of black people shut out of this process, which just puts people way back right there.
Yeah.
And you are clouding the judgment of another group of people because they're getting something.
Yeah. What it appears to them, I mean, it's kind of like a double think kind of thing is that this is Social Security is a right. And in the last 30 years or more, any attempt by the Republicans to try to privatize Social Security has gone down in flames. So you can see how popular and important it has been for working people, and it is seen to some extent as a right, But that the fact that black people got into the Social Security system a generation after, you can really understand how intergenerational wealth, has been rewarded. This whole idea of intergenerational wealth that people are, because and this is something that really is important to understand. And I think that most working people, black and white, have an understanding of this, is that I pay into Social Security, not just for myself, but for my parents.
Right. But I think this difference in a generation that didn't really get to participate in this lag, I think that is invisible to white and black people right now.
Yeah,
Mostly.
absolutely, absolutely. Much more so to whites, because
Yes.
there are lots of black folks whose family history, goes back to memories of living, maybe not necessarily as sharecroppers, but in many cases as sharecroppers, and knowing their family history. I mean, they're obviously more woke
Right.
than whites, but but if we're looking at this thing, we have to ask ourselves: there was a radical movement among workers in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and yet, um, in spite of that, they accepted this Social Security Act, with the exceptions that were in place.
Right.
And you would think that if there was a movement of solidarity, if there was a sense, why would people, would these industrial workers who were fighting to organize their unions in Detroit and, Toledo, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, and all of these other places, and the big cities of the Northeast, and all of the other cities around the country that had general strikes, Seattle and San Francisco. Why were they so? Why was this fatal flaw, this to solidarity, allowed to persist? And let me tell you, there was a lot of fight back over this. There were other proposals that were made about Social Security, different bills that were introduced in the mid 1930s that were much more egalitarian, and that were based on citizenship. And also more redistributive. Social Security is on one level is a scam, because the workers pay in, right? The wage earner pays in, and supposedly that's matched by the employer, right? But the employer simply has to raise the prices on his on his goods,
Yeah.
what he's selling, to be able to compensate for that. So really, the employers are not putting anything in. What's happening is that they're
putting it on everyone else.
Yeah, it's on the consumers, whoever that body of people is. But certainly, it is not being paid by employers out of their own pocket.
Right.
But there were bills that were introduced at the same time as the Security Act that we got, that said, no, we're not going to have this. It's all going to be from the employers.
Right.
And we're going to provide for people who are unemployed on top of that. So this is just going to be a wealth tax. And that's what's going to pay for it, for employed and unemployed, mm-hmm. for housewives, for women who stayed at home and whose job is to do housework and sustain
right.
agricultural workers, for domestic workers, for everybody who was a citizen of the United States. Right. And they're not going to put in contributions. This is going to come out of the general tax fund, and we're going to tax the wealth on a graduated tax basis, right? Right. So that would have been real wealth redistribution,
right?
And there were lots and lots of people who were involved in the movement, millions of people who were involved in supporting those bills, and they got suppressed in Congress because the Dixiecrats were in charge. They were in control. They ran the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was the majority.
I just want to interrupt because I see that it's 12 o'clock, and I don't know if you have.
Wow.
I don't know if you have some kind of wrapping up statement or something that you want to do.
I'm not even looking at the clock.
Well, it's right here where I can see it, so I thought I ought to tell you.
All right. Well, there's a lot more to discuss. Tamara has suggested that we do something like this every like once a month or every 6 weeks. We're going to determine that in the future.
Okay.
But we'll say goodbye for Tamara. Okay. And it's been really great to have this conversation.
Always a pleasure, David, to talk with you about these things, and it just helps reinforce for me, you know, bit by bit, because I mean, I know I've talked with you about all of these things, but you know, there are details that get more fixed in my mind so that I can say things to other people too. So I thank you.
Thank you. And we've only really begun to scratch the surface on.
I know we have.
What we're dealing with is power relations, yeah. and the obstacles to solidarity, and the ways in which we can build a permanent solidarity that is based on equality, not just on temporary alliances.
Yes, that's what we need to do. Okay.
So power to the people, and that's my my signal that we're.
You have to hold up until you get turned off. Okay.
Okay.
I think you have to stay like that until someone notices and turns the cameras off.
All right. Well, I don't know if
I don't know.
Yeah, Mara was working the controls.
Yeah, and I don't know if she's maybe pulled away briefly into something else, because I don't know how to shut this down. I mean, I see a button on my screen that says stop camera, so I can do that.